On a bitter February morning in 1511, the most powerful king in Europe, a man whose very presence commanded awe and terror in equal measure, was reduced to a mere father, helpless and broken. In the opulent, yet now suffocatingly silent, chambers of Richmond Palace, King Henry VIII held his dying son in his arms. The tiny infant, Prince Henry, Duke of Cornwall, was not yet 2 months old, yet he carried the weight of a nation's hopes on his fragile shoulders. For 7 weeks, England had rejoiced, celebrating the birth of a male heir, a sign from God that the Tudor dynasty, forged in the bloody Wars of the Roses, was finally secure. But now, watching the life drain from his son's small body, Henry felt the cold grip of a terror far greater than any battlefield could instill. What the young, virile king couldn't possibly know in that agonizing moment was that the silence that would soon fill the room would not be the end of the story. It was the beginning. The fading breath of this one tiny prince was not just a personal tragedy. It was the spark that would ignite a firestorm of chaos, a conflagration that would consume England for generations, tearing apart the very fabric of its society, condemning thousands to the executioner's block, and ultimately forging a new, ruthless monarch from the ashes of a grieving father's shattered dreams. This is the story of how one infant's death unleashed a chain of events so catastrophic that it would reshape a nation, and how a single, silent breath that never came would echo through centuries, a chilling testament to the fragility of power and the devastating consequences of a king's despair. The news of Prince Henry's birth on New Year's Day, 1511, had been met with a wave of euphoria that swept across England. The kingdom, still haunted by the specter of civil war, had craved a male heir for the young and ambitious King Henry VIII. At just 19 years old, Henry was the epitome of a Renaissance monarch, handsome, athletic, and fiercely intelligent. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the pious and noble daughter of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, had secured a crucial alliance with Spain and promised a stable future. Yet, the Tudor claim to the throne was still a recent and, in some eyes, precarious one. Henry's father, Henry VII, had seized the crown on the battlefield, ending the Wars of the Roses, but the legitimacy of the dynasty still rested on a knife's edge. A male heir was not just a desire. It was a political necessity, a divine seal of approval on the Tudor reign. Catherine of Aragon, a woman of deep faith and royal breeding, had already endured the heartbreak of a stillborn daughter the previous year. The pressure on her to produce a son was immense, both from her husband and the nation. So when the cry of a healthy baby boy finally echoed through the halls of Richmond Palace, the relief was palpable. The court erupted in celebration. Church bells pealed across London for 3 days and nights, a continuous, joyous clang that was audible for miles. Bonfires were lit on every hilltop, a chain of light that stretched from Cornwall to the Scottish borders, a visible symbol of England's jubilation. Henry, a man of grand passions and even grander gestures, spared no expense in celebrating the arrival of his son. He ordered the distribution of alms to the poor, with coins bearing the royal arms being scattered from palace windows. Heralds proclaimed the news in every market square, and taverns were granted royal licenses to serve free ale to all who would drink to the prince's health. The court itself became a whirlwind of festivities. The centerpiece of the celebrations was a magnificent tournament held at Westminster in February. It was a spectacle of unparalleled grandeur, designed to showcase Tudor power and wealth to the world. Henry, a skilled juster, personally competed, his armor glinting in the winter sun as he rode against the greatest knights of the realm. The tournament was a carefully choreographed display of chivalry and martial prowess, but it was also a stage for international diplomacy. Ambassadors from across Europe, including representatives from France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, were in attendance, their presence a testament to England's growing influence. The Venetian ambassador Andrea Badoer, a shrewd observer of court politics, reported back to his masters in Venice with detailed accounts of the lavish proceedings. He described the king's magnificent pavilions, temporary wooden structures covered in cloth of gold, and the elaborate feasts that followed the jousting. The menus were a testament to England's wealth, featuring exotic delicacies imported from across the globe, peacocks served with their tail feathers intact, elaborate sugar sculptures depicting scenes of royal triumph, and the finest wines from the vineyards of France and Spain. The gifts presented to the newborn prince were equally extravagant. The Venetian ambassador presented a golden cradle adorned with precious stones, while the French delegation arrived with silks and tapestries worth a king's ransom. The Spanish court sent holy relics believed to protect infants from harm, along with a chest of gold coins specially minted for the occasion. Even the infant's wardrobe was a work of art, with tiny garments crafted from silk, velvet, and cloth of gold, embroidered with pearls and precious threads. Each outfit was blessed by royal chaplains before being placed on the prince, a ritual that underscored the sacred nature of his royal person. The christening of the prince, held in the Church of the Observant Friars at Richmond Palace, was a ceremony of immense political and religious significance. The church was transformed into a glittering showcase of Tudor wealth, with every surface draped in cloth of gold and precious tapestries. The holy water used for the baptism had been blessed by Archbishop Warham himself, using relics of English saints, and the holy chrism for his anointing was specially prepared with oils blessed by the Pope. The godparents chosen for the young prince were a carefully selected group, reflecting Henry's strategic thinking. Louis XII of France and Margaret of Austria, regent of the Netherlands, were represented by their proxies. Their inclusion a clear signal of Henry's desire to forge strong alliances with the major powers of Europe. By binding these foreign rulers to his son through the sacred bonds of godparenthood, Henry was weaving a web of diplomatic ties that he believed would secure his dynasty's future. In these early weeks, Prince Henry, Duke of Cornwall, was the center of the universe. His nursery at Richmond Palace was a miniature court in itself, employing over 30 servants, including wet nurses chosen for their perfect health and moral character, rockers whose sole duty was to keep his cradle in gentle motion, and watchers who maintained a constant vigil to ensure his safety and comfort. Every detail of his life, from his feeding schedule to his sleeping patterns, was meticulously documented by his attendants and reported daily to the king. Henry, in turn, was a doting father, a side of his personality rarely seen by the public. He visited his son's apartments daily, often spending hours watching the infant sleep or feed, his face alight with a pride and joy that surprised even the most seasoned courtiers. The future of England seemed bright, secure in the tiny hands of the Golden Prince. Beneath the glittering facade of royal celebration, however, a quiet anxiety simmered. The 16th century was a brutal time for infants, with a mortality rate that claimed 1 in 3 children before their first birthday. Even for a royal prince, surrounded by the best care that wealth and power could provide, life was a fragile thing. The medical knowledge of the era was a primitive blend of ancient texts, superstition, and humoral theory. The royal physicians, led by Catherine's Spanish doctor, Fernando de Victoria, were educated in the traditions of Galen and Hippocrates, believing that health depended on the balance of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Their attempts to safeguard the prince's health, though well-intentioned, were often based on practices that would seem bizarre and even harmful by modern standards. Bloodletting was a common treatment for a wide range of ailments, and even pregnant women were subjected to it. Herbal concoctions, often containing a bewildering array of ingredients, were prescribed for everything from a cough to a fever. The alignment of the planets was considered a crucial factor in a child's survival, and astrologers were consulted to determine the most auspicious times for important events. The prince's nursery, though opulent, was a potential breeding ground for disease. The heavy tapestries that adorned the walls, designed to keep out drafts, also harbored dust and germs. The constant burning of incense to purify the air did little to combat the real threats of infection. The protocols surrounding the prince's care, though elaborate, were a testament to the fear that permeated the royal court. No one was allowed to approach the infant without first undergoing purification rituals. Food tasters were employed to ensure that the wet nurse's diet was free from any potential toxins that could be passed on to the prince through their milk. Despite these precautions, the first signs of trouble began to emerge in the 6th week of the prince's life. The detailed records kept by his attendants noted subtle changes in his behavior. The infant who had been so vigorous and alert at birth began to experience periods of listlessness, his once lusty cries becoming weak and intermittent. His feeding patterns became irregular, with moments of eager nursing followed by episodes where he showed little interest in nourishment. His complexion, which had been a healthy, rosy pink, sometimes took on a pale, almost grayish hue. These symptoms were initially dismissed as normal fluctuations in an infant's health. The royal physicians, including Dr. de Victoria, were reluctant to alarm the king and queen, hoping that the changes were temporary. They consulted their ancient texts, prescribed new herbal remedies, and ordered increased monitoring of the prince's breathing, temperature, and responsiveness. But as the days passed, the periods of quietness grew longer, and the prince's movements became less vigorous. Whispers of concern began to circulate among the nursery staff, though they were careful to keep their fears from reaching the royal couple. Catherine of Aragon, still recovering from childbirth but driven by a mother's intuition, began to spend more and more time in the royal nursery. She observed her son with a keen eye, her heart sinking with each new sign of his declining health. Her Spanish attendants, who had witnessed her previous heartbreak, saw the growing worry in her eyes, though she maintained a composed facade in public. Henry, too, sensed that something was wrong. His daily visits to the nursery became more frequent and his questions to the physicians more detailed. The buoyant optimism that had characterized his early fatherhood began to give way to a gnawing anxiety. The weight of his own hopes and those of his kingdom rested on the tiny, ailing prince, and for the first time in his life, the all-powerful king was faced with a challenge that he could not conquer through force of will or royal decree. The golden cradle, once a symbol of a secure future, was beginning to feel like a precarious one, and the whispers of fear in the royal court were growing louder with each passing day. The end came with a chilling swiftness that shocked even the most experienced royal physicians. In the pre-dawn hours of February 22nd, 1511, the night watchers in the royal nursery noticed a dramatic change in the prince's condition. His breathing, which had been shallow and irregular, became labored, each breath a struggle. His skin, which had been pale for days, now had a deathly pallor, the grayish tinge that physicians recognized as one of the most ominous signs of infant illness. A frantic summons was sent for Dr. de Victoria and the other court physicians, who rushed to the prince's side. They employed every remedy known to 16th-century medicine, a desperate and ultimately futile arsenal of treatments. Bloodletting was performed, in the belief that it would rebalance the prince's humors. Poultices of herbs and animal parts were applied to his tiny body. Royal chaplains were called to offer prayers, their voices a somber drone in the tense atmosphere of the nursery. Henry, awakened by the commotion, arrived to find his son in the final stages of his struggle. The king, who had once been the picture of youthful confidence, was now a study in helpless anguish. He took the tiny, frail body of his son into his arms, his own powerful frame shaking with emotion as he watched the life ebb away. Contemporary accounts describe the king's tears falling onto his son's face, a poignant image of a father's love rendered powerless in the face of death. For a few agonizing minutes, the infant prince clung to life, his breathing becoming increasingly shallow until, at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, it ceased altogether. The silence that descended upon the room was profound, broken only by the heartbroken sobs of the Queen. Prince Henry, Duke of Cornwall, the Golden Prince who had been the hope of a nation, was dead. He had lived for just 52 days. The official report from the royal physicians attributed the prince's death to natural causes, a vague diagnosis that acknowledged their inability to identify the specific illness that had claimed his life. In an age before modern medicine, infant death was a common and often inexplicable tragedy. The doctors, despite their best efforts, were as helpless as the king and queen in the face of what was likely a common infant infection, a simple ailment that would be easily treatable today. The news of the prince's death spread through the palace like a cold fog. The jubilant celebrations that had filled the air just weeks before were replaced by a stunned silence. The courtiers who had vied for royal favor, who had celebrated the prince's birth with such enthusiasm, now found themselves navigating a court plunged into mourning. The funeral of Prince Henry Tudor was an affair of state, an event of unparalleled solemnity and expense. Henry, in a desperate attempt to channel his grief, threw himself into the planning, determined to honor his son with a funeral worthy of a future king. Westminster Abbey was transformed into a cathedral of mourning, with every surface draped in the finest black cloth. Thousands of candles created a forest of flickering light, their glow illuminating a scene of profound sorrow. The funeral procession stretched for miles through the streets of London, a somber parade of nobles, clergy, and common citizens. The prince's tiny coffin, crafted from the finest English oak and covered in velvet and precious metals, was carried by the highest-ranking nobles of the realm. The Archbishop of Canterbury, William Warham, led the funeral service, his voice heavy with grief as he offered prayers for the soul of the departed prince. Yet, even in the midst of this profound sorrow, the wheels of politics continued to turn. Ambassadors from across Europe, who had so recently celebrated the prince's birth, now offered their condolences, their words carefully chosen to convey sympathy while also reassessing their own nation's strategic positions. The French court, which had seen the prince as a potential rival, now saw an opportunity to exploit England's renewed vulnerability. The Spanish officials, who had pinned their hopes on Catherine of Aragon's son, now worried about her diminished influence in a kingdom where her primary value had been her ability to produce a male heir. The English nobility, too, faced the immediate challenge of navigating a court where the future was once again uncertain. The factions that had vied for power during the prince's brief life now had to recalibrate their alliances, their loyalties shifting in the face of a new political reality. The empty cradle at Richmond Palace, once a symbol of hope and stability, had become a potent symbol of the Tudor dynasty's fragility, a chilling reminder of the precarious nature of power and the devastating consequences of a single, tragic death. The silence that followed the prince's demise was not just the absence of a baby's cry. It was the deafening sound of a kingdom's future thrown into chaos. The death of their son plunged Henry and Catherine into a deep and profound grief, a sorrow that would cast a long shadow over their marriage and the future of England. Catherine, a woman of deep piety, sought solace in her faith, spending hours in prayer and attending Mass daily. Yet, her grief was compounded by a sense of personal failure, a feeling that she had not fulfilled her primary duty as queen. The years that followed were marked by a series of miscarriages and stillbirths, each one a fresh wound to a heart already broken. Henry, a man of action and ambition, struggled to cope with his grief in a very different way. He threw himself into the pursuits that had always brought him joy: hunting, jousting, and military exercises. He became increasingly obsessed with martial prowess, as if seeking to conquer his own feelings of helplessness through physical exertion. Yet, the loss of his son had created a psychological wound that would never fully heal. The once confident young king became increasingly paranoid, his behavior growing more erratic and his temper more volatile. The psychological impact of the prince's death on their marriage was devastating. The shared sorrow that could have brought them closer together instead became a source of growing distance. Henry, driven by his desperate need for a male heir, began to see Catherine not as a beloved wife and partner, but as a symbol of his own failure to secure his dynasty. The biblical passage from Leviticus, which warned that a man who married his brother's widow would be childless, began to haunt him, a dark premonition that he would never have a legitimate son with Catherine. The court, ever sensitive to the moods of the monarch, began to reflect the growing rift between the king and queen. The once vibrant atmosphere of celebration was replaced by a tense and somber mood. The courtiers, who had once celebrated Catherine as the mother of the future king, now began to whisper about her age and her inability to produce a healthy male heir. The Spanish ambassador, a once honored guest at court, found his influence waning, his presence a constant reminder of Catherine's connection to a foreign power. The years that followed were a cruel cycle of hope and disappointment for the royal couple. Each new pregnancy was greeted with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, the court holding its breath as it awaited the outcome. Yet, each time, their hopes were dashed, the cycle of miscarriages and stillbirths reinforcing Henry's growing conviction that his marriage was cursed. The birth of a healthy daughter, Mary, in 1516, brought a brief respite from the gloom. Yet, even as he doted on his daughter, Henry could not shake his obsession with a male heir. He knew that a female ruler would be a precarious proposition in a kingdom still scarred by the memory of the Wars of the Roses. The need for a son who could secure the Tudor line and guarantee the stability of his kingdom, became an all-consuming passion, a driving force that would ultimately lead him to challenge the authority of the Pope and tear his kingdom from the Catholic Church. The death of his firstborn son, Prince Henry, had set in motion a chain of events that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. The once pious king, a man who had been awarded the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope for his defense of Catholicism, was now on a collision course with the very institution he had once championed. The grief and despair that had consumed him in the wake of his son's death had festered, transforming into a ruthless determination to secure his legacy, no matter the cost. The seeds of chaos had been sown, and they were about to bear a bitter and bloody fruit. The king's great matter, as his quest for an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon came to be known, was the culmination of years of frustration, grief, and a growing obsession with securing his dynasty. The death of his firstborn son had left an indelible mark on Henry, a deep-seated fear that the Tudor line would not survive without a male heir. His subsequent failures to produce a healthy son with Catherine only served to reinforce his conviction that his marriage was not blessed by God. The emergence of Anne Boleyn, a charismatic and ambitious lady-in-waiting at the English court, provided Henry with both a new object of his affections and a potential solution to his dynastic problem. And, unlike Catherine, was young and fertile, and Henry became convinced that she could provide him with the son he so desperately craved. Yet, his desire for Anne was complicated by his existing marriage to Catherine, a union that had been sanctioned by the Pope and was considered inviolable by the Catholic Church. Henry's initial attempts to secure an annulment from the Pope were met with a firm refusal. The Pope, Clement VII, was under the political influence of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was adamantly opposed to the annulment. The Pope's refusal to grant Henry's request set the stage for a dramatic and unprecedented confrontation, a clash between the King of England and the head of the Catholic Church. The years that followed were a period of intense political and religious turmoil. Henry, advised by a new generation of ambitious and reform-minded courtiers, including Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, began to challenge the authority of the Pope in England. A series of parliamentary acts were passed, culminating in the Act of Supremacy in 1534, which declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England, effectively severing the kingdom's ties with Rome. The English Reformation was not initially driven by a desire for theological reform, but by Henry's personal and political needs. Yet, once the break with Rome was complete, it unleashed a wave of religious change that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The Protestant ideas that had been circulating in Europe for decades now found fertile ground in England, and the new Church of England began to adopt a more Protestant theology. The dissolution of the monasteries, a move orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell, was a key part of this transformation. The vast wealth of the monasteries, which had been a powerful and independent force in English society, was seized by the Crown, a move that not only enriched the royal treasury but also broke the power of the Catholic Church in England. The monastic lands were sold off to the nobility and gentry, creating a new class of landowners who had a vested interest in the success of the Reformation. The break with Rome also had a profound impact on England's international standing. The once close alliance with Spain was shattered, and England found itself increasingly isolated in a Europe divided by religious conflict. The threat of invasion from Catholic powers, particularly Spain and France, became a constant concern, forcing Henry to invest heavily in his navy and coastal defenses. The English Reformation was a period of immense social and cultural change. The familiar rhythms of religious life, which had been a central part of English society for centuries, were disrupted. The beautiful and ornate churches of the medieval period were stripped of their statues and stained glass windows, a visible symbol of the new, more austere form of worship that was being imposed. The English language, which had once been relegated to the sidelines in religious services, now became the language of the Church with the publication of the first English Bible. The personal tragedy of Henry VIII, his desperate quest for a male heir, had unleashed a whirlwind of change that would reshape England in ways that no one could have predicted. The death of his firstborn son, a seemingly insignificant event in the grand sweep of history, had become the catalyst for a revolution that would transform England from a Catholic kingdom on the fringes of Europe into a Protestant nation with a global destiny. The religious and political turmoil of Henry VIII's reign was not without its human cost. The king who had once been hailed as a golden prince, a defender of the faith, now became a ruthless and tyrannical monarch, a man who would stop at nothing to secure his power and his legacy. The quest for a male heir, which had been the driving force behind the Reformation, became an obsession that consumed him, leading him to commit acts of unspeakable cruelty. The executions of Thomas More and John Fisher, two of the most respected and devout Catholics in England, were a chilling demonstration of Henry's newfound ruthlessness. More, the former Lord Chancellor, and Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, were both beheaded for their refusal to accept the Act of Supremacy. Their deaths sent a shockwave through Europe, a clear signal that Henry would not tolerate any opposition to his will. The dissolution of the monasteries, while a strategic move to break the power of the Catholic Church and enrich the royal treasury, also resulted in immense suffering. Thousands of monks and nuns were driven from their homes, their ancient way of life destroyed. The beautiful and historic monastic buildings were stripped of their treasures and left to fall into ruin, a visible scar on the English landscape. The religious persecution that characterized Henry's later reign was not limited to Catholics. The king who had once championed the Catholic faith now found himself at war with both Catholics and Protestants. The 6 Articles of 1539, which reaffirmed traditional Catholic doctrines, were a clear demonstration of Henry's theological conservatism. Yet, at the same time, he continued to execute those who refused to accept his supremacy over the Church. The result was a confusing and often contradictory religious policy, a policy that created a climate of fear and uncertainty. The personal lives of Henry's wives were also a casualty of his tyrannical reign. Catherine of Aragon, the once beloved queen, was cast aside, her marriage declared invalid and her daughter, Mary, declared illegitimate. She died in 1536, a broken and forgotten woman. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry had broken with Rome, also met a tragic end. When she failed to produce a male heir, she was accused of treason and adultery, a charge that was almost certainly fabricated. She was beheaded in 1536, a victim of the king's ruthless ambition. Henry's subsequent marriages were a desperate and often tragic quest for a son. Jane Seymour, his third wife, finally gave him the male heir he so desperately craved, a son named Edward. Yet, she died just a few days after giving birth, a victim of the high mortality rate that characterized childbirth in the 16th century. Henry's later marriages to Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr were all marked by political intrigue and personal tragedy. The death of Henry VIII in 1547 did not bring an end to the religious and political turmoil that he had unleashed. His son, Edward VI, a devout Protestant, pushed the English Reformation in a more radical direction, a move that was met with resistance from many of his subjects. His death in 1553, at the age of just 15, plunged England into a new succession crisis, a crisis that was a direct legacy of his father's desperate quest for a male heir. The reign of Mary I, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, was a brief and bloody attempt to restore Catholicism to England. Her persecution of Protestants, which earned her the nickname Bloody Mary, only served to further divide the kingdom. Her death in 1558, after a reign of just 5 years, paved the way for the accession of her half-sister, Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. The legacy of Henry VIII was a complex and often contradictory one. He was a man of immense talent and ambition, a king who had transformed England from a medieval backwater into a modern nation-state. Yet, he was also a ruthless and tyrannical monarch, a man who had sacrificed his wives, his friends, and his faith in his desperate quest for a son. The death of his firstborn, Prince Henry, had set in motion a chain of events that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier, a chain of events that would leave a bloody and indelible mark on the history of England. In the end, the story of Henry VIII Firstborn is a chilling reminder of the power of a single moment to alter the course of history. The death of a 52-day-old infant, a tragedy that would have been forgotten in any other family, became the catalyst for a revolution that would reshape a nation and the world. The empty cradle at Richmond Palace, once a symbol of hope and stability, became a symbol of a king's despair, a despair that would drive him to acts of unspeakable cruelty and ambition. Had Prince Henry Tudor lived, the history of England would have been profoundly different. The English Reformation, with its violent and bloody consequences, would likely never have happened. The dissolution of the monasteries, the rise of parliamentary power, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and the glorious reign of Elizabeth I, all of these pivotal moments in English history were a direct consequence of the king's desperate quest for a male heir, a quest that was born from the grief and despair of a father who had lost his son. The story of Henry VIII Firstborn is a story of what might have been, a story of a path not taken. It is a story that reminds us that history is not just a series of grand events and powerful figures, but a tapestry woven from the threads of individual lives, a tapestry where a single, silent breath can have a profound and lasting impact. The forgotten prince, who lived for just a few short weeks, cast a shadow that would stretch for centuries, a shadow that would shape the destiny of a nation and the world. And in the quiet halls of English history, the echo of his silent breath can still be heard, a chilling testament to the power of a single, tragic death to change the world forever. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, share and comment below. See you in the next one.